They say a duke can outrun anything with a fast enough horse. Ronan Wycherley believed it for 2 years. He married the woman his own carelessness had burned, the woman who had lost her father to his fire as he had lost his brother, and then he set her down at a soot-blackened ruin in a Herefordshire valley and rode for the coast so that he would never again have to look at what he had done. He expected her to fade there quietly, the way ruined things fade. He did not expect to come home to a valley of orchards heavy with fruit, to casks of cider rolling down to the river, and to a wife who owed him nothing and would forgive him only if he first learned to stand still and face the flames he had spent his whole life fleeing. This is the story of the ashes she refused to be buried under, and of the man who had to walk back into fire to earn the right to stand beside her. The chapel was cold, and it smelled of tallow and old stone, and there were no flowers. Winifred Sennett stood at the rail in a grey gown that had belonged to some taller woman, and she waited for the man beside her to say the words that would make her a duchess. He said them the way a man reads a bill of lading, flatly, giving each syllable its due and no more. He did not look at her. She had learned in the 3 weeks since the fire to know when people would not look at her, and this one had raised the not looking to an art. His eyes stayed on the clergyman, on the register, on the middle distance where nothing waited. When the moment came for her to sign, she took up the pen with her right hand, and her right hand would not close. It was the burns. The fire had taken the skin of her palm and the 2 smallest fingers and left them fused a little, stiff as green wood, so that the pen rolled loose in them and clattered on the wood. She caught it against her wrist. She dragged the letters of her name across the paper in a shape that was hers and yet not hers, ugly and effortful, and she felt the man watching the hand at last, because the hand was the one part of her a person could watch without seeming to stare at her face. When she had finished, she set the pen down and turned her scarred cheek deliberately toward him, and he looked away. Ronan Wycherley, Duke of Aldermere, was marrying her for reasons he had told no one, and would not have survived saying aloud. Some of them he could almost name. He owed her a debt of blood, and a man of honour discharged his debts. But underneath the honour lay a colder, more useful thing, and he knew it was there even as he refused to look at it directly, the way he refused to look at her face. If the truth of that night ever walked abroad, that the fire in the cider barn had not simply happened, that a hand had set it going, the Duke of Aldermere would be finished in the courts if a magistrate were bold, and in the drawing-room certainly, which for a man of his rank was the same as death. A burned, portionless girl with a dead father and a claim against his house was a danger left loose. A burned, portionless duchess provided for, sheltered, and shut away in a Herefordshire valley behind his own name was a danger made safe. He told himself it was atonement. It was atonement, and it was also a lock turned on a door, and the 2 motives fit together so neatly that he never had to examine either. That was why he gave her a ruin instead of a fortune. A fortune would have been remarked upon. A fortune settled on a nobody would have set tongues counting and asking why. A debt-encumbered estate that his family had let rot for a decade was a thing he could sign over without a single eyebrow lifting in London, and it discharged the obligation on paper while costing him almost nothing he valued, and best of all, it set her down 200 miles from any room he would ever enter. He had done the sum without once writing it down. He gave her Whitcomb because Whitcomb was worthless, and because worthless was exactly the size of the grave he needed her to occupy. They rode a full day through the marches with the curtains drawn, and he said perhaps a dozen words. The country grew steep and green and secret, valleys folding into valleys, and at the end of the light they came to the place that was to be hers. Winifred put back the curtain and looked at Whitcomb Grange, and her breath caught. Half of it was black. The west wing had burned some years before, in a smaller fire that no one had troubled to mend, and the flames had left the stones scorched and the windows blind. As the carriage rolled up the last of the drive, she took the rest of it in the way she would soon learn to take in everything, quickly, and to keep count, ivy hauling the walls further down. The orchards behind the house run to grey ruin, choked with mistletoe, a press-house sagging on its one good hinge. Rooks clattered up out of the chimneys at the grind of the wheels, and wheeled off complaining over the dead trees. The whole place breathed out at her, even from the drive, a smell of wet char and abandonment, and she understood, with a cold and perfect clarity, that he had chosen it for exactly that reason. He handed her down himself, which surprised her. His hand under her elbow was steady and entirely impersonal. "The staff are 3, he said. "Mrs. Denby keeps the house. There is a man for the grounds, a girl. The estate carries debts. They are settled upon you now, with the property, in the marriage articles. You will want for nothing this season. After that, the rents may serve if the tenants can be got to pay. And you," she said. It was the first thing she had said to him all day. "I sail from Bristol in the morning. Lisbon, and then wherever suits. My affairs abroad are—" He stopped. "Long." "How long?" He looked at the black wing of the house, and for one moment something moved in his face that she could not read, something that was not indifference at all but wore its clothes. "I do not expect to return," he said. So there it was, spoken plainly at last. He had married the proof of his crime, carried it as far from himself as an ocean would allow, and set it down in a valley where it might rot unwitnessed. She looked at him, at the clean, hard, handsome line of him, at the guilt he thought he was hiding behind a bill of lading voice, and she felt something in her own chest go very still and very hard, like water freezing over. "Then good night, your grace," she said. "I shall not keep you from your ship." He left before dawn. She heard the horse in the yard, one clear ring of iron on cobble, and then the long diminishing of it down the valley, and she did not go to the window. She lay in the cold bed in the one habitable wing and listened to him go, and she thought, quite calmly, that a man who could not bear to watch a thing die had no business condemning it to death in the first place. He had not even had the courage to stay for the funeral of the marriage he had made that morning. The last of the servants went a fortnight after him. They had never been more than 3, and they had been afraid of the house before she came. Now they were afraid of her as well, of the burned face at the top of the stairs, of the way she walked the black wing at dusk as if she were counting it. The kitchen girl went first, in tears, muttering about the curse. Then the man for the grounds, who took the last sound horse with him, and called it wages owed, and dared her with his eyes to send the law after a duke's runaway servant, when there was no duke within 1,000 miles to send it. Only Mrs. Denby stayed, a wide, weary woman of 60, with hands cracked from a lifetime of scrubbing, and a mouth pressed thin against complaint. And even Mrs. Denby stood in the kitchen doorway one grey October morning with her bundle at her feet. "It's cursed, my lady," she said, not unkindly. "The old fire, and now this new grief on top of it. 2 men dead in a burning barn. They say the trees won't bear again. They say the valley's turned its back on this house for good." "Do they?" said Winifred. "I could go to my sister at Ledbury. She'd take me. There's no shame in you coming too, my lady. A duchess needn't sit in a ruin to keep faith with a man who'd not sit in it a single night himself." "No," Winifred agreed. "She needn't." She was standing at the cold hearth with a letter in her stiff hand, a letter from a man in Hereford, who was owed £40 by the estate, and meant to have it in goods if he could not have it in coin, and had sent word he would come with a cart and a strong man to take it out of the house in furniture. She had been trying, for the better part of an hour, to write him a reply. The pen would not sit in her fingers. 3 times she had gripped it, and 3 times it had turned in the ruined flesh and made a blot, and the last blot had torn clean through the paper. She stood there with the ruined letter and the ruined hand, and she was aware of the enormous cold of the house pressing in around her, and the debts, and the coming winter, and the ocean between her and the only creature on earth who was bound to her, and she felt the whole weight of it come down at once. She sat down on the hearthstone and she wept. It was not delicate weeping. It came up out of her raw and shaking, the grief for her father, whom she had watched carried out of that barn under a sheet, the fear, the burned skin that pulled and stung when she made a fist, and under all of it, the sheer animal loneliness of being the one thing in the world that a rich man had paid to have taken out of his sight. And Mrs. Denby, who had meant to walk out of that door and had every right to, instead set down her bundle and came and lowered herself onto the cold stone beside the new Duchess, and put a cracked, warm arm around her, and said nothing at all, which was the wisest thing anyone had said to Winifred in a month. When it had passed, Winifred wiped her face with the back of her good hand, and looked at the torn letter lying on the flags, and something in her turned over and set, the way iron sets when it cools. "He thinks I will die here," she said. Her voice had gone flat and steady. "Quietly. He put me in a grave with the roof half off it, so that he would never have to watch me use it. That was the whole of his plan for me. My lady, I'm not going to die here." She said it plainly, testing the shape of it, and found that it held. "I'm not going to be buried under his ruin to spare his conscience the sight of me. This house is mine now. He made it mine with his own hand, in the articles. The debts are mine, the trees are mine." She turned her right hand over and looked at it, the fingers half shut like a claw, and she made herself open them, slow and burning, until the scarred palm lay flat against the cold air. "And this is mine, and I will make it work again, if I have to teach it its whole business one finger at a time." Mrs. Denby looked at her for a long moment. Then she braced her hands on her knees and heaved herself up with a groan, and picked up her bundle and carried it back through into the scullery and set it down and tied on her apron. "Well," she said, "there's no fire laid and no bread risen, and the rain's coming through the still-room ceiling in 3 places. If we're not dying, my lady, we'd best start somewhere, because ruins don't mend themselves out of spite." They started with the letter, and to write the letter Winifred bound her hand. It was Mrs. Denby's notion in the end, a strip of clean linen wound so that the 2 fused fingers were braced straight and the wrist held rigid, so that the whole hand became a single stiff instrument instead of a bag of broken parts that betrayed her at the worst moment. It was clumsy, and it hurt, and it looked like something a farrier had done to a lamed horse. But when she gripped the pen against the braced thumb and drove it with her arm and her shoulder, instead of trusting the dead fingers, the letters came. They were large and rough and slanted, but they were letters, and they were hers, and the man in Hereford had his answer within the hour. That the Duchess of Aldermere acknowledged the debt in full, that she would pay it in cider at a fair market price come the autumn after next, and that if he sent a man to strip so much as a fire-iron out of a peer's house before that day, she would have him before the assizes for trespass and theft from the person of a duke's wife. She was not at all certain the assizes would trouble themselves for a burned woman alone in a valley, but the name Aldermere was a heavy name, heavier than she had known, and the man in Hereford did not send his cart. That was the first thing she learned about her husband's leaving. The name he had flung at her like a coin thrown to be rid of a beggar was worth more than he had ever bothered to reckon, and he had left the whole of it lying in her 2 hands. The trees were the second thing she learned, and they taught her more slowly. There was an old man at the head of the combe named Corbin, who had been the orchardman at Wychcombe in the Grange's better days, before the first fire, before the family stopped caring whether the valley lived or died. He lived now in a stone cottage with a goat and a lifetime's memory of trees, and Mrs. Denby knew him, and one cold, bright morning at the end of October, Winifred walked the length of the valley to find him. He was as gnarled as a pollard willow himself, taciturn to the edge of rudeness, and when she came up to his gate he looked full at her burned face without so much as a flinch, which she liked him for before he had said a word. "They're not all dead," she told him of the orchards. "I've looked. There's green under the bark still, low down, on the old ones." "Aye," he allowed, chewing on nothing. "Some. The old standards, the deep-rooted ones. Frost took the young stock 2 winters back and no man grafted over it, so that's gone to firewood. Rest is choked, mistletoe and canker, and no pruning in 6 year. Wants 10 men and 2 full seasons, and a purse behind them. I have you," she said, "and myself and Mrs. Denby, and no purse at all." He looked at her a long moment, and then he almost smiled, which on Corbin was a landslide. "Then it wants a miracle, my lady, and I'm too old to be a miracle." "No," said Winifred, "it wants grafting. Show me how it's done." He did not believe she meant it, and she made him show her anyway. He cut a scion from a living standard, a clean whip of last year's wood, and pared the end of it to a long wedge with his knife, and split the crown of a frost-killed young rootstock, and set the living wood down into the dead, and bound the joint tight with a strip of soft bast, and daubed it over with clay worked with grease. 3 cuts, a fit, a binding, a seal. She watched his hands do it twice, and then she held out her own for the knife. Her first cut opened her own thumb to the bone. The braced right hand would not turn a blade, and she could not both pin the scion in the dead fingers and cut with the good hand, and the knife skated off the wet wood and bit her, and Corbin made a low sound of disgust and reached to take it back. "No," she said through her teeth, and put the cut to her mouth and thought. She learned, over that first winter, to graft with a broken hand, which every orchardman in the county would have told her could not be done, and which she did anyway because no one had told her, and there was no one to do it for her. She learned to clamp the scion between the heel of the stiff hand and her own ribs, so that the good hand was free for the knife. She learned to make the split with a wooden mallet and a chisel instead of trusting the strength of a grip she no longer had. She learned to feed the strip of bast with her teeth and her good fingers, while the braced hand held the joint as steady as a carpenter's vice. It was slow, cruelly slow. A whole man with 2 whole hands could set a graft in the time it took her to set one, and she took 5. But she had the whole of the winter, and nothing on God's earth to spend it on but this, and by the time the sap began to stir in March, she had driven living wood into more than 300 dead crowns with her own 2 ruined hands. When the buds broke green along those grafts in April, ugly, clumsy, overdaubed joints that a proper orchard man would have been ashamed to own, and every single one of them taking, she stood in the wet orchard with the mist coming off the grass, and she wept again, and this time it was not grief, and she did not try to stop it. Corbin came and stood beside her and looked a long while at the swelling buds along the grafts, at her work, and at last he spoke, and from Corbin it was a coronation. "Huh," he said, and then, "You'll want to thin those hard the first year they crop, or they'll break their own arms trying to carry it all." Which meant, they will crop. Which meant, it worked. Which meant, I am with you now. She had won him, and she had not even known she was fighting for him until she had him. And then she understood he was worth more than any deed of land, because Corbin knew where the frost pooled and which slopes held the water, and how the 200-year-old beam press worked its slow magic, and Corbin, once given, did not take himself back again. The press house was the 3rd thing, and it was the hardest of the 3, because it could not be done by one pair of hands, however stubborn. The great cider press at Witchcombe was a beam press older than anyone living. An oak trunk as thick through as a man was tall, weighted at its far end with hung stones, that came down with unhurried force on the racked pomace, and squeezed the juice out golden. The mill that ground the apples to that pulp was a granite trough and a runner stone that a horse walked round and round to turn. Both had stood derelict so long that the great beam had a sag in it like a tired back, and the trough was split, and the roof over the whole of it let the weather in. Winifred could wake the trees with her own broken hands across a winter. She could not pick a valley's crop alone, nor mill it, nor press it, nor cart the casks to the river, and the valley folk would not come. They believed the place cursed. They remembered 2 men dead in a burning barn. They looked at the burned Duchess walking their lanes and touched their hats and crossed themselves the moment her back was turned. So she did the one thing the gentry never did. She offered them a share. Not wages. She had no wages to give. A share. She walked down to the village at the foot of the combe, and after the Sunday service she stood up on the mounting block by the churchyard wall with her burned face bare in the flat autumn daylight, where every soul in the parish could look their fill at it, and she told them plainly how the matter stood, that the trees would crop that autumn, and she could not get the fruit in alone, that any household which sent hands to prune, and to pick, and to work the press, would take away a share of the finished cider, cask for cask, in fair proportion to the labour they had given, to drink or to sell as they saw fit, that she asked no man among them to believe the valley was not cursed. She asked only whether a man would rather have a cursed cask of good cider standing in his own barn, or an empty barn, and the satisfaction of having been proved right about the curse, and that she, for her own part, meant to have both the cider and the last laugh, and would be glad of the company at either. There was a silence in the churchyard, and then a man at the back of the crowd laughed, not unkindly, and called out that the Duchess drove a harder bargain than the old Duke ever had, and that he had a curse of his own at home in the shape of 6 children who ate a great deal more than they earned, and that he supposed one more devil in the valley could hardly make the arithmetic worse. And he came, and where one came, the rest came after him, slow and grumbling and sidelong, because a share is a share, and hunger is an older god than superstition, and it eats better. That first autumn, half woken and only half in leaf. The revived standards cropped lightly, but they cropped. The whole valley went sweet and heady with the smell of crushed apples and the deep yeasty reek of the must beginning to work. The horse walked the mill. The great beam came groaning down on the racked pomace, and the juice ran out golden into the vats, and Winifred stood in the middle of the press-house with her sleeves rolled past the elbow, and her scarred arms wet to the shoulder, and her bound hand aching in its linen, and she was, for the first time since the night of the fire, entirely and simply happy. They made 40 hogsheads of cider that year. She paid the man in Hereford his £40 in it, cask for cask, at a fair market price, and had the receipt witnessed by the parson, and folded it away, and kept it, the first debt of the house of Aldermere ever discharged by her hand, rather than run from. The next autumn they made 300. The trees she had grafted came into their strength all at once, and the old standards pruned now and fed and cleared of their strangling parasites, threw a crop such as the oldest men in the parish had not seen in 30 years, and had stopped expecting to see before they died. Wychcombe cider went down the valley on carts and down the river on barges to the quays at Gloucester, and on toward Bristol, and it was good cider, clean and dry and strong, with a bite to it that a man remembered, and it began, that second year, to be asked for by its name. The debts of the estate came down like a fever breaking. The kitchen girl came back, shamefaced, and was taken on again without a word about the leaving, and a boy came for the yard, and 2 more maids, and a carter. The black west wing still stood as black and blind as the morning he had left it. Winifred would let no one touch it, but the rest of the house grew warm and lit at night, and smelled of baking bread and drying herbs and the good tallow and wood smoke smell of a place that was lived in on purpose. Mrs. Denby grew stout and content and ferociously proprietary, and would say to any pedlar or parson who came to the door that her mistress had raised the dead with her own hands, and dare them to argue it. Corbyn, one evening at the tail of the second harvest, in front of the whole tired, laughing press crew, called Winifred the true master of Wychcombe, and then looked utterly appalled at himself for having said a soft thing out loud, and stumped off into the dark, muttering about the horse's off-hind shoe, and it was the finest thing anyone had ever said to her, and everyone in the press-house knew it, and no one was fool enough to say so. 2 full years and 2 full harvests after a duke had ridden away down the valley at dawn, the Duchess of Aldermere sat in the little counting-room at the end of the press-house with a ledger open before her, and her linen-bound hand resting flat on the page, and she was solvent, and she was respected, and she was, she had lately decided, entirely finished with grief. She had built a whole life out of char and frost and other people's fear, with a hand a surgeon had written off, and it was hers, and no one could take it from her, and she wanted precisely nothing from the man across the sea except that he should have the courtesy to stay across it. And now a 3rd autumn had come round, and the trees she had grafted were bowed under a heavier crop than either year before, and the picking was 3 days begun, which was, of course, the exact season the man chose to come home. Ronan Wycherley had spent 2 years discovering that an ocean is not nearly so wide as a guilty man needs it to be. He had gone to Lisbon, and then to Vienna, and then through a long blur of hired rooms in cities whose names he had not troubled to keep, and in every one of them he had lain awake and smelled smoke that was not there. He had believed, when he set Winifred down at Wychcombe, that distance would work upon guilt the way it worked upon sound, thinning it mile by mile until it dropped below hearing. It had not. The fire was inside him, and it travelled at exactly his own speed, and it kept up with a fast horse and a faster ship without the least difficulty. He saw it when he closed his eyes. The cider barn, the lantern he had struck from its hook in a blind fit of temper, he could no longer even remember the cause of, the straw catching quicker than a man could think, the run of flame up the loft ladder, Marcus above, her father below, at the vats, himself in the doorway, screaming 2 names into a wall of heat that threw him bodily back into the yard. He had got the girl, only the girl. He had reached into the doorway and closed his fist on a handful of her burning sleeve, and hauled her out into the mud, and beaten the flames off her with his own coat and his own bare hands, and then he had not been able to reach the men, and he had knelt in the wet dark and watched the barn come down on the 2 of them. He had never told her that either, not the truth of the lantern, and not the truth of the sleeve. She believed, he was sure, that the fire had simply happened, the way fires in barns happen, and that some servant or other had dragged her clear. She did not know that it had been his hand at the beginning, and his hand at the end of it. That was the thing he could not carry and could not set down and could not confess, that he was, in the same breath, the cause of her ruin, and the reason she had lived to know it. He had married her to house the danger and salve the debt. He had fled her because every time he looked at her scarred face, he saw his own hand in the making of it, and he was too great a coward to hold that gaze for the length of a single supper. He came back, he told himself, only to be finished with it. Word had reached him by a roundabout road. A factor at Gloucester who traded in cider had mentioned the Witchcombe casks in a letter to his man of business, that the estate he had signed away as worthless was somehow paying its way, that the grave he had dug was, impossibly, not behaving like a grave. It unsettled him more than ruin would have, and so Ronan, who wanted nothing on earth so much as to be rid of every last stone that could remind him, resolved to ride down and cut the final tie, to look on what was left, press upon the woman whatever clean settlement of money would free his conscience, and put an end, decently and forever, to the marriage he had run from. The estate was hers. He could not take it back, and had no wish to. He wanted only to be quit of the last thread that still bound his name to hers. He rode up the valley on a grey afternoon in the 3rd September, braced for a rotting shell and a bitter, dying woman, and he checked his horse at the mouth of the combe, and could not, for the space of several breaths, make sense of what he was looking at. He rode in through gates that had been mended and freshly painted, up a raked and weeded drive, between orchards that climbed both flanks of the valley in ordered, pruned, propped rows, the branches bowed and staked under the sheer weight of fruit. Among the trees, whole families were working, ladders going up, baskets filling, children calling to one another across the rows. A cart rolled past him piled with roped casks, and the carter touched his hat to him as to any passing stranger, and drove on down toward the river without a second glance. The press house at the yard's edge stood sound and roofed and loud with work, and out of its wide-flung door poured a smell of crushed apples so thick and sweet it stopped the breath in his throat. And under that smell, unmistakable, the long, deep, groaning note of a great beam-press taking the weight, a sound he had known since he was a boy in this valley, before the family let it die. Only the west wing stood as he had left it, black, blind, roofless, open to the sky. It rose there in the middle of all that living green like a burned thing that had been kept on purpose, and he did not yet understand that it had been kept on purpose, and for him. He rode into the yard, and no one ran out to take his horse. A boy glanced at him once and went back to rolling a cask up a plank. A maid crossed the yard with a yoke of pails and did not curtsy, because she did not know him from any other well-dressed man come to buy cider. He swung down from the saddle himself and stood there holding his own bridle in the yard of his own estate, like a petitioner at a strange door. And then a woman came out of the press-house, wiping her hands on a sacking apron, and it was Winifred, and for one whole moment he did not know her. She was brown from a summer in the open, and there was hard, practical muscle in her bare forearms, and her sleeves were shoved up past the elbow, and her right hand was bound in a strip of linen. And her face! He made himself look at her face, because he had spent 2 years not looking, and the scars were there still, the drawn skin along the cheek and the jaw, the pull at the corner of the mouth. But that was not what struck him. What struck him, like a hand laid flat against his breastbone and pushing, was that she was looking back at him with no fear in her at all, and no hope in her at all, only a cool and complete and unhurried indifference, as though he were a cart stopped in the lane that she must wait to see move on before she could get about her afternoon. "Your Grace," she said, "you've chosen a busy week. We're 3 days into the picking." Winifred! Her name came out of him rougher than he meant it. He gestured, helplessly, foolishly, at the whole valley, the laden trees, the carts, the roaring press. "This. You did this. I had a good deal of help." She glanced past his shoulder at his horse, and at the road behind it, plainly and only waiting to learn how long the interruption meant to last. "You'll want to see the accounts, I expect, since they've stopped costing you money. The east side of the house is habitable. You may have the steward's room at the end of the passage. It's small, but it's dry, which is more than the great rooms are. Those stay shut. So does the west wing. That stays exactly as it is. It is my house," he said, and heard, The instant it was out, how it sounded, and would have given a year of his life to have it back. "It is my house," she answered, without heat, without even the courtesy of anger, the way a clerk states a settled point of law. "The articles you signed made it mine, together with the debts which are paid, everyone, and witnessed. You'll find it all in the ledger, in my own hand. Supper is at 7. Mrs. Denby will show you where you're to sleep." And she turned and went back into the press-house to her work, and left him standing in the yard. He stood there a long time after she had gone. He had come to look on a ruin and press a purse on a dying woman, and be quit of the whole business forever, and there was no ruin, and there was no dying woman, and he was not quit of anything. He was a stranger loitering at the edge of a life that had been built, plank by plank and graft by graft, out of the very wreckage he had made and run from, built by the woman he had buried alive to spare his own eyes, who now looked at him as one looks at weather. One must simply wait out. He did not leave the next morning, as he had meant to. He told himself he stayed only to satisfy himself the thing was truly sound, to read the ledgers, to see the trade with his own eyes before he pressed his settlement and went. He took the steward's room at the end of the passage, small and dry as she had promised, and he lay in it that first night, and smelled, instead of smoke, the whole valley's worth of crushed apples coming through the window on the cool air, and he slept and did not dream of the barn, and woke astonished and obscurely ashamed of having slept so well. He was, he discovered across the following days, entirely superfluous. He was a duke. He had spent the whole of his life inside a world that arranged itself quietly around what he wanted, before he had finished wanting it. Here nothing arranged itself around him at all. Out of pure long habit he gave an order in the yard, told 2 men to shift a stack of casks out of the way of the door, and the men stopped and looked at him, and then looked past him toward the press-house where Winifred was, and did not lay a hand on the casks until she came out and said, mildly, that the casks were precisely where she wanted them, "Thank you," and that if his Grace found himself wanting an occupation, the far orchard had not yet been picked, and there were spare baskets stacked against the wall. He had never in his life picked an apple. He went, because the only thing worse than going was to stand in the yard being useless in front of men who had just watched him corrected, and he climbed a ladder in his good boots and filled a basket badly, bruising half of what he touched. And old Corbin came and showed him, without one grain of deference and without any patience at all, how to cup the fruit and lift and twist, so that the apple came away clean and the fruiting spur stayed on the tree for next year. He did it again, and did it better, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 2 years eased by the width of a hair. So, he worked. He never once decided to. It simply came to be easier to work than to stand about being a duke at people. His soft hands blistered, and then the blisters broke, and then the skin under them hardened. He learned to pick, and then to sort, and then to feed the mill and rack the pomace and the valley folk, who had been wary to a man of the returned lord, and half expected him to turn them all off the land the moment the fancy took him, watched him blister his ducal hands beside them, and slowly, grudgingly revised him, from a threat to a curiosity, to, at the last, simply another back and another pair of hands, which at the height of a harvest is the highest rank there is, and cannot be bought with any title in the realm. He slept at night. He ate like a labouring man. He said very little, and she said less, and between the two of them passed only the terse, practical words the work required. Another basket here, mind the beam coming down, the near vat's full, shut the sluice. And under those plain words nothing at all was said, and both of them knew nothing was being said, and neither would be the first to break the surface of it. And then Sir Peregrine Hollis moved to strangle her trade, and Ronan found out he was not so superfluous as all that. Hollis owned the wharf at the river's edge, where the Witchcombe casks were rolled onto the barges for Gloucester and Bristol. He was a sleek, well-fed, grasping man of inherited land and small soul, and he had watched the Duchess's cider prosper for 2 seasons, and had done the sum in his head, and the sum told him she had no other road to the water. So one grey morning his man met the Witchcombe carts at the wharf head, and announced that the wharfage due was tripled from that hour, and that if the Duchess did not care for the new rate, she was welcome to carry 300 hogsheads to the sea on her own scarred back. It was a blockade dressed up as a fee. If she paid it, her whole margin vanished into Hollis's pocket. If she refused it, 300 hogsheads of good cider sat in the yard through the winter and soured to vinegar. She stood on the wharf with her ledger under her arm and her bound hand, and argued the point flatly, reasonably at length, and Hollis's man smirked and let her argue because a burned woman with no husband standing at her shoulder was, in his long experience, the safest creature in England to rob. Ronan had ridden down with the carts that morning. He had told himself it was to see the river trade with his own eyes, for the accounts. He sat his horse at the back of the little crowd and listened, and something cold and old and useful woke up in him, and he walked the horse forward through the carters, and Hollis's man's smirk faltered on his face, because a duke on a good horse is a wholly different quantity from a woman with a ledger, and the man's body knew it before his mouth did. "You are Hollis's man," Ronan said. It was not a question, and he did not raise his voice. He had learned from watching her that the flat voice carried furthest. "Carry him this, word for word. Tell Sir Peregrine that the Duke of Aldermere stood on this wharf this morning and heard his new schedule of dues read out. Tell him the Duke keeps rooms in town and dines at the Lord Lieutenant's table, and has a long and particular memory for the names of small men who try to squeeze his people while they think his back is turned. Tell him the old rate will stand again by tonight's tide, the old rate not a penny over, or the Duke of Aldermere will make it his own personal occupation, at court and at every dinner table in 3 counties, to explain to the whole of them exactly what manner of man Sir Peregrine Hollis is. Can you carry all of that, or shall I write it down for you?" He said it quietly, without heat, in her flat voice, and it was the first time in 2 years he had spent the weight of his name on anything at all but running from it. The man carried all of it. The blockade broke overnight, the old rate stood by the next tide, and Hollis, who had badly underestimated the reach of a duke he had counted absent, spent the whole of the following season being very carefully, very sweatily cordial to the house of Aldermere. Winifred said nothing to Ronan about it that day, but that evening she set his supper before him with her own bound hand, instead of leaving it to Mrs. Denby to carry in, and from Winifred that was a speech, and an ode, and near enough a thank you, and he understood it, and had the sense to say nothing, and only eat. But there was a wound in her still that the estate could not mend, and there was a wound in him that a broken blockade could not touch, and before the season turned they had each been made to look at the others. Hers came first, and it came at the drying oast. There was a floor there where the keeping apples were racked over a low, banked charcoal fire, and turned by hand through the long days of the drying, and it was slow, close, exacting work, and on the 4th day of it Winifred was up on the racks reaching to turn a high tray when her bound hand failed her. It simply would not close on the tray's edge. The dead fingers slid. The linen was no help. 2 years of teaching them their business counting for nothing in that one instant, and the tray tipped, and she came off the rack backward with a whole floor's worth of drying fruit spilling after her, and she would have gone down hard on the packed earth floor among the coals if Ronan had not been below her, feeding the fire, and turned and caught her, clumsily both arms, taking her weight and half his own into a graceless heap against the wall, well clear of the banked charcoal. For a moment neither of them moved. He could feel her heart going hard under his forearm, and her breath coming quick with the fright of the fall, and he felt too the small, shameful tremor that ran through her bound right hand where it had failed her, the hand she never let anyone see fail, and he understood, holding her, that the scars were not a thing that had happened to her once in the past and healed. They were a thing that went on happening, quietly, every day, in every reach and grip and small refused task, and that she carried the daily fact of it without a word to a living soul, because she had decided long ago that pity would finish what the fire had started. The tray slipped, she said, getting her feet under her, pulling out of his arms, her voice gone hard and even. "That is all. Let go. Winifred, let go. It's nothing. It happens." And she took up the fallen tray in her good hand and turned her back on him, and went on with the work, and he let her, because he had learned that much at least, that some things she would take from no one, and that to force his help on her was only another way of telling her she was less than whole. But he did not forget the tremor in the hand. He had made that hand. He had made every daily small defeat it would ever suffer. He fed the fire and watched her work one-handed at what should have taken two, and the old smoke rose up in him, and he did not run. His own wound broke open 2 days later, and it came out of fire, and it nearly cost her life to draw it out of him. It was the height of the picking, and the oast was the one fire on the whole estate, watched day and night, and Winifred of all people watched it, she who knew better than any soul in England what a fire could do to a life. But in the black middle of the night a rack came down. No one ever knew quite how, whether the prop shifted or the timber gave, and it spilled a whole tray of drying fruit down into the banked coals, and the old tinder-dry timber of the oast floor caught, and by the time the boy on watch had run screaming into the yard, the whole lower floor was alight and the flames were climbing into the roof, and Winifred ran for it. It was not sense, it was 2 years of her own life racked and drying in that building, the keeping crop that would carry the whole valley and every family in it through the coming winter, and she snatched a horse blanket and soused it in the trough and dragged it over her head, and went in through the smoke to fling the far vents wide and haul out what rack she could reach, and the fire, which had been up in the roof, came down all at once into the doorway behind her, a solid falling wall of it, and cut her off, and she was shut inside the roaring dark, with the only door gone. Ronan was in the yard. He heard the boy shrieking that the Duchess was inside, and he stood one instant in the red glare of the burning oast, and every muscle in his body that had spent 2 years fleeing fire locked rigid and screamed at him to stay back, back, that this was the thing that had killed Marcus, the thing that had killed her father, the thing that lived behind his eyes every night of his life. And then he saw the doorway full of falling fire, and he knew that she was behind it, and the terror went out of him all at once, not conquered, not mastered, simply burned clean away, because there was only one thing on the far side of that fire, and it was her, and a man does not calculate about the one thing. He went in. He beat the burning fall of it aside with his bared forearm, and dropped low under the smoke where the air still lived, the way the harvest had taught him the air lives low, and he found her by the far vents on her knees, half choked, still stubbornly dragging at a rack she could not lift alone, and he got an arm around her waist and hauled her up bodily, and for one wild instant she fought him, still reaching back for the crop, and he put his mouth to her ear and roared her name into it, and she went slack and let him. He got her round, and got the soaked blanket over them both, and carried her out through a doorway that was by then a standing sheet of flame, through it, into it, and out the other side, his coat and his own back to the worst of it, out into the yard and the cold night air and the shouting, and the two of them went down together into the wet grass, both of them, coughing up the whole inside of the fire. The oast burned to its stone footings before the bucket chain from the village could touch it. They saved, in the end, perhaps half the drying crop. It did not matter. She was alive in the wet grass with his arms still shut around her, and he was shaking so hard his teeth knocked in his head, ash-grey in his hair and streaked black down both bared arms, and she turned in his grip and looked up at him through streaming, smoke-stung eyes, and for the first time she saw all the way down into the man, past the flat voice and the averted eyes, right to the bottom, to the thing that lived there. That night, when the fire was long dead, and the last of the crew had gone home hoarse and reeking, and Mrs. Denby had washed the worst of the ash off the both of them, and set them by the kitchen hearth wrapped in blankets with brandy that neither had touched, it broke out of him at last, and he could not stop it, and he did not try. He could not stop looking at his own hands. The ash had got down into the cracks of his blistered palms, and would not wash out of them, and he turned them over and over in the low firelight, and he was still shaking, and Winifred, hoarse, scorched, wrung out to nothing, watched him do it, and understood that something was working loose in the man that had been fused as tight and as long as the dead fingers of her own hand, and she waited. She had learned, across 2 hard years, that some things cannot be forced out of a person. You can only hold the ground, and keep still, and wait. "I have to tell you a thing," he said. His voice was not the bill of lading voice. It was a boy's voice, and it was cracked straight down the middle. "I should have told you 2 years ago in that cold chapel. I married you so that I would never have to tell it, and then I ran across an ocean so that I would never have to stand in a room where you might learn it on your own. That was the whole of the coward's plan, from beginning to end, and it has failed, because I find tonight that I would rather you knew the truth of me and hated me to my face than went on not knowing it and merely being indifferent to me across a room, which I have discovered is very much worse than being hated. Then tell me, she said, quite steadily, and stop rehearsing it. The fire. He shut his eyes. Our fire. The one that took your father and my brother and your hand. It was mine, Winifred. Not a mischance. Not a fallen candle no man could help. Mine. I quarrelled with Marcus that night, in the barn, over some idiot thing I cannot now even remember. Money, or a horse, or nothing, and I went out through the barn in a black temper, and I struck the hanging lantern off its hook with my arm as I passed, and I did not stop. I heard it fall behind me, and I was too far gone in the temper to turn back for it, and by the time I understood what the light at my back was, the straw was gone up, and Marcus was in the loft, and your father was at the vats below him, and I could not. His voice went out entirely, and he had to find it again. I got you. You were nearest the door. I could reach you, and I could not reach them, and I got you out and beat the fire off you with my own coat, and I have the marks of it still, and then the roof came down on the two of them while I knelt in the yard and screamed. He opened his eyes and made himself look full at her scarred face, in the firelight, and hold the look, and it cost him visibly everything he had ever had. That is why I could never look at your face, not the scars, my own hand in the making of the scars. Every time I looked at you, I watched myself knock down that lantern and walk away, and I let you believe it was your ruined face I could not stomach, and that was a lie, and it was crueler than the truth, and I let you carry it for 2 years, so that I would not have to carry this. There is no word for what I am. I have looked for one in 4 countries, and there is not one. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire settled in the grate with a small collapsing sound, and Winifred sat with the whole true shape of it turning over and over in her at last, the averted eyes, the flight, the ocean, the grave of a house he had buried her in, all of it not contempt for what the fire had made of her, but naked terror of what his own hand had done. And she found, to her own great surprise, that the anger she had kept banked and glowing for 2 years did not flare up in her at the truth of it. It had gone out somewhere in the long work of those years without her ever noticing it go, quietly, under its own ash, the way a fire goes out when there is nothing left to feed it. What was left in the place where the anger had been was something older and more tired, and, she found, more merciful than she had known she still owned. You dragged me out, she said at last. That night. I never knew whose arms they were. I've known for 2 years that someone reached into that fire and took hold of my sleeve and pulled me into the air, and I never once knew who. She looked at his ruined, ash-blacked hands, at the old white burn marks she had never thought to read. It was you, the same hands. You knocked down the lantern, and then you put your own hands into the fire and pulled me out of it. Both, the same 2 hands, the same night. It does not balance, he said low. 1 life pulled out against 2 left in to burn. It does not begin to come near balancing, and I will not pretend to you that it does. No, she agreed, it doesn't. Nothing will ever balance it. Some things don't balance, they just have to be carried. She reached across the space between them, slowly with her bound right hand, the stiff burned claw of a hand that he had watched tremble on a register in a cold chapel 2 years before, and had not been able to look at, and she laid it over his shaking one, and closed it as far as it would close. But you can stop running from it. That much is in your gift and no one else's. You can stand in it instead. You did it tonight. You, of all men, walked straight into a burning door and pulled me out of the fire a second time, and you did not run. Her scarred fingers pressed down on his. That is the only atonement there is, Ronan. It was never distance. It was this. It was staying in the room. And he turned his hand over under hers and gripped it, the ruined hand, without a flinch, without one particle of the old flinching, and he bowed his head down over both their joined hands and wept, the way she had wept on the cold hearthstone 2 years before, raw and shaking and past shame. And she did not tell him to stop, and she did not take her hand away. She held the ground, and she held the ruined hand in his, and she let him. After that night the frost between them was gone, and what came to grow in the place where it had been came slowly, the only way she trusted anything to come, the ugly, clumsy, overdaubed joints of it slowly knitting into something that would bear weight. They worked out the tale of the harvest side by side, and he stopped pretending, even to himself, that he had stayed to read the accounts. He laboured in the orchards until his hands were as hard and horn-calloused as Corbyn's own, and he learned the whole slow craft of the press, and he carried casks, and along the lanes the valley folk quietly stopped calling him Your Grace among themselves, and began to call him the Duke the way they might have named a fixture of the place, a bridge, a weir, a landmark, with a rough, proprietary, half-grudging fondness, because a man who blisters his own hands beside you through a whole picking has bought himself a standing that no rank on earth can purchase, and no rank can take away. He deferred to her in every matter that touched the estate, not as a show of humility, but because she was plainly and simply the master of the place, and he was a man learning a trade late and badly, and they both knew it, and there was an odd ease in his knowing it, and in the long evenings they took to sitting by the kitchen fire, the two of them, and talking, at first only of the work, the trees, the weather coming down off the Welsh hills, and then, by slow degrees, of everything else. Of Marcus, whom he had never in 2 years been permitted by his own guilt to grieve aloud, and who came now into the warm kitchen and sat with them, and was, at last, mourned. Of her father, whom she could speak of. The 2 dead men came into the room those evenings and were remembered together, out loud, instead of each in his own separate silence, which is, in the end, the only way grief is ever finished with the living, not forgotten, but at last carried by more than one pair of hands. One evening, at the very end of the picking, he drew off a cup of the new cider straight from the working vat, cloudy and sweet and sharp on the edge, the first of that year, and carried it across the press yard to where she sat on an upturned cask, with the whole valley going gold and violet behind her in the falling light. He put the cup into her good hand, and then, deliberately, in the plain sight of Corbyn and Mrs. Denby and half the tired crew, he reached down and took up her scarred right hand in both of his, the hand he had once watched tremble and turned his face away from, the hand that had grafted 300 dead trees back to life and bound itself in linen to hold a pen, and dragged a whole cursed valley up out of the ashes single-handed, and he lifted it and turned it and pressed his mouth to the burned palm of it, slowly, and held it there, and did not flinch, and did not let it go. The crew, being valley folk and merciless, whistled and jeered and stamped and toasted the pair of them in new cider, and Winifred went scarlet to the roots of her hair under her sun-brown and her old scars. But she did not take her hand back, and if some of the older women, walking home down the lane afterward, wondered aloud and tartly among themselves whether his Grace had passed 2 celibate years of continental grieving before he came riding home to press his mouth to a poor woman's hand, and laughed low about it in the dark, well, Winifred wondered it too in her guarded way, and had decided some while since that a man was to be measured by what he did in front of her in the daylight, and not by what she could not see across an ocean, and that she would keep the wondering, like the west wing, standing quietly and unanswered where it was. The black carriage came a week later, glossy and crested, and out of another world entirely, and out of it, in grey silk, with a face like a closed and audited account, stepped Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Aldermere, with a folded document in each gloved hand. She had come, she made it known within a quarter of an hour of crossing the threshold, to put an end to a scandal. She looked at the burned Duchess in her sacking apron, with pomace stains to the elbow and her hair coming down, and she looked at her son with his labourer's blistered hands and orchard leaves in his coat, and she was, in her cold and bloodless way, more appalled than she had words ready for. She had brought 2 papers, and she laid them out on the table in the shut-up east parlour, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has got her way for 40 unbroken years, and does not expect the 41st to be different. The first was a petition for annulment, drawn up clean and tight by the family's men of law, wanting nothing now but Ronan's signature. The marriage had never been consummated. This she stated as a matter of established fact, having made her inquiries, and had plainly been contracted under the duress of a disordered conscience, and could be quietly, decently, and completely undone, as though it had never been. The second paper was a marriage contract, already drawn, to Miss Aurelia Vane, an heiress of impeccable family and £40,000, young, unmarked and willing, for the coronet, to overlook a very great deal about the man beneath it. Ronan had a duty to the name. He had indulged this. She moved one gloved hand to take in the whole valley, the orchards, the press, the wife, this rustic penance of his quite long enough. It was time to come home, to London, to the world, to put the entire shameful episode behind him where it belonged and marry at last, as a Duke of Aldermere was born and bound to marry. She set both papers square on the table and folded her hands and waited, serene in the whole weight of her certainty. Winifred looked at the two papers on the table, and she looked at Ronan standing white beside them, and she felt the old cold water begin to freeze over again in her chest, because of course this was the shape of the ending. This was always going to be the shape of it. He had come home and softened, and she had let herself, against every hard lesson of the last 2 years, begin to hope. And now the world had sent a black carriage up her valley with £40,000 and an unmarked face, and a clean, papered, honourable road out of the whole disaster, and no man born to that name walks away from all of that to press cider in a Herefordshire combe beside a burned woman. She had built her entire life so that it would never again depend on this man staying. She had been right to build it so. She had only for one warm week let herself forget why, and she did not intend to stand in a parlour and be discarded a second time. She had too much left of herself for that. "You should sign it," she said to Ronan, flatly, quickly, before he could open his mouth, in the level voice she had used on the man in Hereford and on Hollis's man at the wharf, the voice that gave away nothing at all. "Your mother has the right of it. You've a duty to your name, and I've an estate that runs to the hour without a duke anywhere in it, as you've had 2 full years and 1 good look to see for yourself. Sign the papers. Take the carriage. I'll not stand across the door of £40,000 and a young wife with a face that won't stop conversation in a London drawing-room." She was already turning for the door as she said it, because she would not let him watch her own face do the thing it was straining to do. "You always were a great deal better at the leaving than at the staying, Ronan. At least have the grace to be quick about it this time. I found the slow part very tiresome." She got as far as the parlour door with her hand on the frame, and his own hand closed round her wrist, her good wrist, and stopped her. Not roughly, absolutely, and turned her back into the room, and she saw that his face was not the face of a man weighing £40,000 against a valley of apples. It was white, and it was furious, and underneath the fury it was afraid, but not, she saw, of staying. "No," he said. He let go of her wrist, and he crossed to the table where the 2 papers lay squared and waiting, and for the first time in 40 years the Dowager Duchess of Aldermere's serene certainty flickered on her face. He picked up the annulment petition. He picked up the marriage contract. He held them both a moment, one in each hand, and he looked at Winifred across the top of them, and then he turned and walked to the parlour hearth where the one fire in that shut-up room burned low, and he laid both papers on the coals and held them down flat with the iron until they caught and curled and blackened and went up. £40,000 and a clean road out, and the whole crushing weight of his name's duty, into flame, and then into smoke, and then into grey ash that lifted and fell in the one lit hearth of the house he had let stay dark for 2 years, and had at last come home to. "Ronan," his mother was on her feet, the silk of her whispering, "do you know what you are throwing on that fire? There will be consequences. The family, the entailment. Your uncles will not sit still under this. I cannot answer for what they will do. The name cannot simply be—" "It can," he said. He stood watching the last black flake of the papers lift and turn to nothing on the draught, and he seemed, as they burned, to grow steadier rather than wilder, as though the fire were taking the shaking out of him at last. "You may tell my uncles whatever pleases you. You may tell the whole of London that the Duke of Aldermere has run clean mad in a Herefordshire orchard, and married a cider-maker with a scarred face and a crippled hand, and means to spend the rest of his natural life among apple-trees, and would rather. It is very nearly the truth, and I find I am not ashamed of a word of it." He turned from the fire to Winifred, who stood still at the door where his hand had stopped her, and every soul in the room, his mother rigid by the table, Mrs. Denby frozen in the passage with a tray gone forgotten in her hands. The maid halted on the stair, was looking at the two of them and not breathing. "I spent 2 years running from this valley," he said, and his voice was low and level now, and it carried into every corner of the shut room, "because I could not bear to stand in the one place on earth where the fire had been. And then I came home to sell the grave I'd dug, and I found that she had taken the fire, the very worst thing I have ever done in my life, the thing I set going with my own hand and my own temper, and grown an orchard out of the ashes of it. I have watched her do, with one broken hand, what I could not have done with 2 whole ones and every advantage in England behind me. I burned her whole life to the ground, and she built this out of what I left, and she asked me for nothing, and tonight she forgave me a thing that no honest reckoning says can be forgiven." He drew a breath. "I am not going back. Not to London, not to the name as it wants to be carried, not to a purse I don't need and a woman I will never love for the sake of a coronet on a christening. This is my home. Not the title, this valley, this house, with its burned wing that she keeps standing to remind us both what we came up out of. And her, she is my home. I was a very long time learning the difference between a house a man is given and a home a man is let into, and I am not fool enough, having learned it at last, to put it on the fire to please my mother." There was a silence in that room you could have heard a bud break in, and then the Dowager Duchess of Aldermere gathered up her grey silk and her closed, appalled, audited face, and swept out of the parlour and down the raked drive to her waiting carriage without one word more, promising with the whole rigid line of her back the consequences she had named and would not or could not describe. And the black carriage turned in the yard and went glossy and crested down the valley and out at the mouth of the combe. And what the family and the uncles and the entailment and the whole offended machinery of a great name would in time make of a duke who had burned his duty in an orchard hearth, that was a reckoning still somewhere down the road, and neither of them, that evening, troubled to ride out and meet it. Let it come when it came. They had both of them faced worse fires than any his mother could kindle, and had walked out the far side of them, and knew now that they could. Ronan crossed the parlour to Winifred, who had not moved from the door, whose careful, level, indifferent mask had at last entirely come down, so that he could see everything that had been living behind it. The hope she had beaten flat twice, and that would not, for all her beating, stay down. The old braced fear of the leaving, and the love she had refused for 2 years to spend on a man who might yet ride away. He stood in front of her and took up both her hands, the whole one and the burned one, and folded them in against his own chest, over the heart, where she could feel it going. "I stayed," he said. "Do you see it now? This time I stayed." "I see it," she said, and her voice was not level in the least any more, and she let it not be. "And I will keep on staying. Every harvest of my life. I want to learn the whole of it from you, the grafting and the pressing and the keeping. I want to be some earthly use to you. I want to grow old in this valley, pretending to Corbin that I know one end of a knife from the other. I never once said the word to you all this while." His grip tightened on her ruined hand. "The sorry word. I have not said it, and I find I cannot make myself say it, because a word that's small set against a thing that large would be an insult to the both of us, and you would know it for the cheat it was, and so would I. I mean to spend the rest of my life saying it the only way it can honestly be said, in staying, and in the work, and in standing in the fire beside you every time one comes, for as long as I have hands to stand there. If that is not enough for you, tell me now, and I will still not leave. I will only be sorry in the doing and never in the word, for the whole of my life." And she looked up at him, at the man who had knocked down the lantern and then reached his own hands into the flame, who had run to the far side of an ocean and then walked back into a burning door for her, who could not say the small word and had chosen instead to spend a lifetime being it, and she found that she believed him, not because he had said a thing, but because he had, twice now, done the thing in fire, when it would have been so much easier to run, and believing him was the last and hardest graft she ever set, and it took. "Then stay," she said, "and stop making speeches at me in a cold parlour, and kiss me, since you've already given half the county the sight of you mooning over my hand in the press yard. You may as well finish what you began." And he laughed, the first full, unguarded laugh she had ever heard come out of him, that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and he took her scarred face gently in his two hard hands, the face he had spent 2 years unable to look upon, and he looked at it now, unhurried, for a long moment, as at the most ordinary and most necessary thing in the whole created world. And then he kissed her, there in the doorway of the house they had both so nearly lost, while Mrs. Denby wept without any shame at all into her apron in the passage, and the maid on the stair forgot entirely to pretend she was not watching. He kissed her slowly, and he did not let her go when it was done, but drew her in against him and held her there, and Winifred, who had built a whole life, plank by graft by cask, on the iron principle of needing no living soul, put her arms up around him and let herself, at the very last, need this one thing, and found that the ground under it held her weight and went on holding. Beyond the parlour windows the valley went dark and quiet. The orchards she had raised out of the ashes with her own 2 ruined hands stood in their ordered, laden rows from the mended gate to Corbyn's cottage at the head of the combe, and the black bones of the west wing stood up against the last light, where she would always keep them standing to remember by, and the one lit hearth in all that house burned low and warm, and held now nothing at all but ordinary ash and ordinary fire. They had been married 2 winters, and had never, until that night, been in truth man and wife, and they made up the lost time between them, in no great hurry, having decided they had years, and in the spring, when the trees she had grafted with her broken hand broke into blossom the whole length of the valley at once, white and blushed pink from the mended gate to the head of the combe, so thick the branches looked snowed on, the 2 of them walked out together into the drift of it, her scarred hand in his calloused one, and neither said anything at all, because everything worth the saying had at last been said, in a cold parlour, over a burning hearth, and the rest of it was only the orchard, doing what she had taught it to do, which was to bear. That was the story of Winifred Sennett, who was bought and abandoned in the ashes and told in every silent way a rich man can tell a poor woman, to die quietly and spare him the sight of it, and who refused, and bound up her ruined hand, and raised a valley of dead trees and a dead marriage both back to life with the same stubborn work. And it is the story of the Duke who ran from what his own hand had done, across 4 countries and 2 years, until a burning oast house and a woman he could not save by running taught him the last thing he learned, and the truest, that there is no road far enough to outrun a fire you started, and that the only way out of one is straight through the middle of it, and that a man earns his home not by the vows he speaks in a cold chapel, but by the mornings he chooses to still be there. He never did say the small word to her. Some men cannot, and she had long since stopped waiting to be paid in words by a man who had begun, at last, to pay her in every other coin there is, in blistered hands and broken blockades, and a body put between hers and the fire, and 2 years of staying, and the years after that. Atonement, she had told him by a dying hearth, was never distance. It is the next harvest, and the one after that, and the one after that, and the scarred hand that is not let go. And if this story has warmed you at all, if you believe, as she came in the end to believe, that the strongest love is not the kind a man inherits or commands or buys with £40,000, but the kind 2 people build with their own hands, season upon season, out of ash and frost and stubborn, unglamorous work, then let it be carried on to someone who needs to be reminded tonight that a thing burned to the ground can be made to bear fruit again, and that it is never, ever too late to turn the horse around and ride back into the valley.